Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast. As it's the last episode before the summer break, well, how about a bit of this?
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, as always, that's everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, title gives it away. I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, release stories, all the ingredients, really, that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast, they lean more towards the mainstream than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of the movies and a real appreciation that somehow, throughout all the labyrinths they have to go through, films get made. I, for one, am very, very grateful that they do. So I do 2 films per regular episode, and I'm just going to get on with the first of them. We're going back to 2015 to kick things off. Bit of James Bond. Let me play you a clip from the trailer. I'll come to the story the other side of this.
You had no authority. None. Mexico City. What were you doing there?
I was taking some overdue holiday.
So what's going on, James? They say you're finished.
What do you think?
I think you're just getting started.
Magnificent, isn't she? 0 to 60 in 3.2 seconds. A few little tricks up her sleeve.
Do one more thing for me.
What do you have in mind?
Make me disappear. Tell me where he is.
He's everywhere.
If you go there, you're crossing over to a place where there is no mercy.
You're protecting someone.
And that is a clip from 2015's James Bond adventure Spectre, directed by Sam Mendes. Screenplay credited to John Logan, Neil Purvis, Robert Wade and Jez Butterworth. Story credited to John Logan, Neil Purvis and Robert Wade. The film starring Daniel Craig, Christoph Waltz, Lea Seydoux, Ben Whishaw, Naomi Harris, Dave Bautista, Monica Bellucci and Ray Fiennes, and directed by Sam Mendes. Now, Sam Mendes had, of course, directed 2012 Spectre at that stage, and to this day, really, the most successful James Bond film of all time. Daniel Craig's third adventure as 007 had generated over $1 billion in box office takings, the first $1 billion Bond. It won an Oscar as well and had earned rave reviews pretty much across the board as well. And so for director Sam Mendes, well, that was pretty much mission accomplished, wasn't it? And with talk turning to what the next James Bond film would be, James Bond 24, well, Mendes was disinclined to come back because how could you top what you'd done before? He'd also, when he was making Skyfall, had to put his commitment to theatrical productions on hold as well. Mendes directs a lot of theatre and he was committed to doing a version of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and also of King Lear. He could even have mashed those up. That would have been quite interesting. So it was the fact that he wanted to get those 2 theatre productions going, and also that it had just gone so well. Did he really want to come back? Well, the people who wanted him back were the core creative team behind Skyfall, and that would be producers Michael G. Wilson and Barbara Broccoli, who'd been directly overseeing the James Bond movies since 1995's GoldenEye, and Daniel Craig, who was, he had the option to do a 4th James Bond film. He had also had the option to duck out of it if he wanted to, but he enjoyed the experience of Skyfall. They'd certainly all enjoyed the aftermath of it. And furthermore, the backdrop to Skyfall and the difficulties in filming that had just cleared a little bit. That Skyfall was made against a backdrop of significant financial difficulties for one of its studios, MGM. that MGM couldn't fund Skyfall at one point, which led to the film both being delayed and also the globetrotting nature of the story just being curtailed slightly. Skyfall is a film that takes place primarily in the UK, and that part of that was fiscal. That was one of the drivers behind why they chose to do that. And now with MGM's financial its finances on a far surer footing, and also the fact that Bond now was making extreme amounts of money that it just hadn't seen the kind of receipts for a James Bond film before that Skyfall had generated. Well, there was a chance to broaden things out. There was a chance to go a lot bigger with James Bond 24. And so there was already talk, even at the end of 2012, in the aftermath of Skyfall's release, that Daniel Craig would be tempted back for one more James Bond film, a swan song story, a chance to exit the role on his terms. And so writing was underway as soon actually as October 2012. Just as Skyfall was being ready for release, John Logan was hired to write the script. Now, Logan had been brought in to do rewrite work on Skyfall, and so he got some form there. His name, too, is also on the screenplay for films such as Gladiator and Martin Scorsese's The Aviator, too. And this was an opportunity for Logan, effectively, to originate the story of what the next James Bond movie would turn out to be. So he was getting to work in the autumn of 2012, and the idea at that stage was to shoot the film in 2013 with a view of a 2014 release. That what MGM didn't want was another elongated gap between the release of James Bond movies, that there was a space of 2 years between Casino Royale and Quantum of Solace, and then it was 4 years from Quantum of Solace to Skyfall, and they didn't want to be waiting 4 years for the next one to come around. Now, the rumour at the end of 2012 was that Logan had actually pitched a two-part story, which to a degree is sort of what happened when Spectre rolled slightly into the film afterwards, No Time to Die. But there was the thinking that could they do two James Bond films at once? A little bit of internet tittle-tattle there. Quite how much smoke and fire there was to it all is unclear, but that was the talk. And certainly the idea of gunning for a 2014 release, well, that made sense as well. Now, Neil Purvis and Robert Wade, who'd been writing on the James Bond films since the 1990s and been the lead writers on them, really, well, it was announced that they were stepping back from Bond in 2012, and that James Bond 24 would be the first 007 movie without their fingerprints on the script for, well, a long time. So a little bit of change behind the scenes. Now, there was also talk about, could this be the movie that brought back a classic James Bond villain, Blofeld? Now, Blofeld as a character had been wrapped up in the ongoing rights disputes that took place between the rights holders of the official line of James Bond films, Danjaq and Eon, and a man called Kevin McClory, who co-wrote Thunderball and held just enough rights to cause mischief. That it was McClory who was behind the unofficial James Bond film in the early 1980s, Never Say Never Again, which was a remake, really, of Thunderball and brought Sean Connery back as an unofficial James Bond. And there had been talk throughout the 2000s that he would look to remake Thunderball again. And until all this was cleared up, it wasn't possible for the official line of James Bond films to cleanly use the character of Blofeld, and nor the infamous rogue organisation Spectre, which is why we get the organisation of Quantum across Casino Royale and Quantum of Solace. Yet what had been murky waters over certain bits of rights were beginning to clear, that McClory passed in 2006. And in the end, a deal was done between MGM and Danjaq and also McClory's estate in November 2013. And that brought all of the rights back under one roof. That now Blofeld was, if you like, back in play, as was the idea of Spectre. And so all of those could be threaded into the script that John Logan was putting together. There was still no director, though. As much as producers Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson were keen to get Sam Mendes back and conversations kept going, there were meetings with other directors and there were other directors linked. So Nicholas Winding Refn, for instance, was very open about the fact that he took a meeting for James Bond. He had a conversation with Robbie Collin of The Telegraph about this many years later and just suggested the meeting didn't go particularly well. Other candidates whose name popped up in the Hollywood trade press included Shane Black, Tom Hooper, David Yates, who was riding half the back of the Harry Potter films, and Ang Lee as well. There was talk that Christopher Nolan had been offered the opportunity and was considering the idea of doing a Bond, but in the time frame that we're talking, he was also committed to making his then next film, Interstellar. And so quite whether Nolan would have gone under the Eon umbrella to make a James Bond film for producers really who had as much of a steer on the story and the way forward as the writer and directors of the films, well, it was unclear really, and it didn't come to pass. But come forward to February 2013, and the rumours were out that Sam Mendes might be back in the fray here, to the point where Broccoli and Wilson were considering delaying the release of James Bond 24 for a further year, just so they could get Sam Mendes back in the director's chair. And these rumours continued to bubble, even as other directors were mentioned. And by May 2013 came the news that felt like an inevitability at that point, that Sam Mendes was indeed in talks to direct the film. Now, it would take a few weeks to lock down his deal, so it wasn't confirmed until early summer. And against this backdrop, casting rumours were coming and going. So Chiwetel Ejiofor was linked with the film at one stage, as was Penelope Cruz. Neither would end up in the final cast of the film. Yet, by June of 2013, all parties, including Sony Pictures, which renegotiated its distribution deal, having distributed the Bond movies since Casino Royale, well, it was to the point where the film was officially announced as happening in June 2013. That this was going forward and James Bond was going to return and Daniel Craig would also be back. What this then gave was a window to get the script right, that Mendes was still attached to theatrical projects that he was working on. And he brought in to work with John Logan a writer by the name of Jez Butterworth, who most recently, at the time of this being recorded, has worked on Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. And he was hired to work with John Logan and help shape the screenplay of the movie. Mendes, of course, now had a toe in as well and was watching. And by the time it got to the summer of 2014, as things were really starting to ramp up, well, the call went into Neil Purvis and Robert Wade that even though they'd stepped away from this particular project, they were now hired back to work on the script for it that was now in a race against time to be ready for the start of production. That the release had slipped to 2015, that much was clear. But to hit that kind of release date, even appreciating just how tight the schedules on Bond movies are, it needed to be filming by the end of 2014, else they would have no chance. The release was being pegged at October 2015. And the idea was originally get filming begun in October 2014. But while they were trying to nail down the script, they had to delay things. And then it became known that the shoot wouldn't be starting until December. This gave Wade and Purvis a chance to put their fingerprints on it a little bit. But this was the first time really they'd come in halfway through the writing of a James Bond film. Usually they've been there right at the start. And so they had to work with what was already in place because sequences were already being plotted and built. And they wouldn't in the end leave the production until it had wrapped. They'd be working on the script even as Spectre, as the film would become known, would be shooting. And what they also did was they decided to reshape the James Bond era under Daniel Craig into something that was all joined together, that they retrospectively went back and looked at elements of Casino Royale and Quantum of Solace and decided that the organisation Quantum could actually be Spectre after all. And so they were looking to put in touch points back to those movies. And so while they were working on the script and while the extensive teams that would be working around the world were scouting locations and building the sequences or certainly doing the pre-production work on them, the casting was coming together, that Daniel Craig was clearly going to be on board, as were returnees such as Ralph Fiennes and Ben Whishaw and Naomi Harris. And then when we're looking at new additions, October 2014, Léa Seydoux and Dave Bautista, it was revealed that they were joining the cast. And the rumours were persisting over who's going to play the villain in the new James Bond film. And by November 2014, the answer to that looked very much like Christoph Waltz, who was going to come in the role of Franz Oberhauser, or was he? the rumour of Waltz's involvement either way was loud, and it seemed that this was pretty much true. And what Sony decided to do in December of 2014 was it decided on 007.com to live stream the announcement of the film and also to unveil the title of it, because we were still in the era here where companies would register domain names for films, and that would lead lots of people to guess what the name of the movie was going to be. So you'd have to register lots of fake web domain names for your movie, etc., etc. So Sony took the proverbial bull by the horns and just decided to announce everything in one go, which it did via a live stream that I remember watching, and it only ran about 10-15 minutes late. That live stream announced the car that was going to be used in the film. It confirmed the casting of Andrew Scott. The car was an Aston Martin DB10, if you're interested in such things. And it also confirmed the casting of people such as Monica Bellucci too, and revealed the title as Spectre. Then it was soon revealed that Christoph Waltz's character was going to be named Oberhauser, which was something that Mendes had found in an Ian Fleming James Bond book, that Mendes had been pouring through Fleming's novels just to find insights and just little things that they could use in the film. He'd had input on the script, as you would expect. And as he would say to Deadline, he said the family history of Bond as a child growing up in Scotland, the idea of him being orphaned after his parents died in a climbing accident and then going to live with an aunt and spending these winters with this man called Franz Oberhauser, who, as Bond says in one Fleming book, was a father figure to me at a time when I needed one. Well, Mendes said these were the kind of clues that they took for the books to the backdrop of the James Bond character, and Mendes said we ran with them. So it was definitely Oberhauser who Christoph Waltz was going to play, and at the point the live stream was broadcast, it was also announced that filming was going to begin within days, that shooting locations for the film were including Pinewood in London, Mexico City, Rome, Tangiers, Morocco. They were going to Austria as well. And as promised, the film was up and running in December of 2014. That the first official footage was shot on the 8th of December 2014. There was a further complication that around this time there was a cyber terrorist attack on Sony servers known as the Sony hack. This was in response to Seth Rogen and Evan Goldberg's film The Invasion, and as a result of controversies surrounding that film, Sony's servers were hacked and completed films were leaked online early, including the Annie remake that was around at that time, and also scripts and internal documents were just leaked onto the internet. In fact, Sony was expecting by this point the script for Spectre to leak online, and early drafts of the film were, as well as correspondence suggesting that the budget for the movie was soaring well beyond the 200 million or so that Skyfall had cost, that there were said to be internal frictions over just how expensive things were getting, and this was clearly going to be the most expensive James Bond film of all time. The final price in the end around $250 million to shoot it, and there was it seemed to be quite a lot of going backwards and forwards behind the scenes just to get everything into shape, and things, well, just a little bit on the tense side. So that first shoot date, 8th of December 2014, well, several units were soon moving in different parts of the world. That one unit was in Austria in December, for instance, even as footage was being captured in Pinewood in the same month. Then the travels around the world soon continued. March 2015, and footage landed online from the shoot taking place in Mexico City. Material shot in Rome had also leaked online. They were doing loads of location work for the movie, and inevitably people were shooting this with camera phones, and they were posting the material online. Now, the Mexico City sequence that opens the movie is hugely ambitious, and also was built in lots and lots of different parts. I managed to ask Sam Mendes about this once upon a time, and he talked about how in Mexico City itself they had 1,500 extras, but also they couldn't actually shoot helicopter footage so close to that many people, and also they couldn't shoot too much helicopter footage around Mexico City, given that it's 7,500 feet above sea level, and so the air as such is too thin to be able to do stunts with a helicopter. And so the prolonged pre-credit sequence in Spectre was shot over 6 different places and ran right throughout the production of the movie. In fact, as Mendes would explain, the putting together of just that opening shot was covering 7 months of work. And it wasn't helped that there were problems at times with some of the rigs at Pinewood. That Mendes told me there were 2 or 3 moments where the rigs were wrong, and how one specific rig we had to rebuild from scratch, and that added 2 weeks, which meant we had to shoot something else, which meant we had to advance something else in the schedule, which we weren't ready to shoot, which then took longer. And this intense shoot was taking place against a ticking clock. That Skyfall had started shooting relatively late to hit a very, very tight release date. Spectre was going to push it even further, that they were working on such a contracted period of time. They had basically 10 months to make this globe-trotting action adventure that was going to cost an enormous amount of money to do so, and they didn't have time in the schedule to stop, else the whole film would be delayed. I should add that in April 2015, Christoph Waltz was downplaying rumours that sprung up online that actually he wasn't playing Oberhauser, he was playing Blofeld in the film, and so he outright put out a denial around that. Towards the end of the shoot, meanwhile, the film ended up in the Guinness Book of Records, that in Morocco in June 2015, an explosion scene was staged that involved 2,224 gallons of fuel and 73 pounds of explosives, that was awarded by the Guinness Book of Records the prize for the world record for the biggest ever movie explosion. And I should note that one person wasn't particularly happy with that. That was Michael Bay, who argued whether it actually was. He argued that stuff he'd put in his 2001 movie Pearl Harbor was bigger, but who's measuring? It should also be noted as well that Spectre came up against some significant problems that threatened to derail and delay the movie, not least the injuries that were piling up. So, for instance, there was an incident in Austria when 3 members of crew were hurt during the filming of a skiing sequence. 2 of those crew members were seriously injured. Then, during a fight scene that takes place between Daniel Craig's James Bond and Dave Bautista's Hinks, Craig suffered an injury that led to production having to stop for a short while to allow him to recover. He picked up lots of injuries on the Bond film. Skyfall, there was a short delay at one point as well. Then, when shooting of that fight scene continued, Dave Bautista got a nose injury during the reshoots for it as well. And also over time, it was revealed that the injury that Daniel Craig had sustained making Spectre was far more significant than the press tittle-tattle had originally put out, that he'd actually broken his leg. And there were a series of options put forward when it was revealed just how severe the injury was. One of which was for Craig to have an operation, which he needed to have surgery, but that would have shut the film down for 9 months. It would have delayed the release to 2016. And the other was to find a way to keep going. And as Craig said, I had to psychologically juggle my physical state, adding that sometimes the leg would, quote, give way because of his injury. And he talked about how at the beginning of the movie, I climb out of a window and walk down a ledge. And he says, I'm literally going, don't give way, don't give way. It was said at one stage, and The Independent reported this, that Craig was struggling to even walk properly due to the injury, and so Mendes and the team had to bring in stunt doubles to take on some of the work. But this had a knock-on effect for post-production as well, in that extra visual effects work was required to graft Daniel Craig's face digitally onto some of the stunt performers. Now, by May 2015, the film was back in London. In fact, it was shutting down Westminster and Lambeth bridges in London for a period of time. 17 arches along the River Thames were lit up at night for a period of 5 weeks to allow Mendes to shoot sequences that were taking place there. Just to manage the night shoot, just to give you an idea of the logistics of a Bond film, the shoot itself on the night, 200 people were required to manage the very basics of that, and the shutting down of the bridges and making sure that they could capture the shots. There was also permissions that they had to get in Rome when they shot a car chase on the streets of Rome, and that involved simply trying to get permission to use specific roads, and often they were turned down. Now, the Rome authorities did in the end shut down parts of the city to accommodate the Spectre shoot, but it was certainly a far cry away from we ask for this and and that's what we get. Then also there was the fact that filming in the end would overrun, that even though they'd been going like the clappers trying to get the footage in the can, filming overshot by 2 weeks, and it formally wrapped up on July the 5th, 2015, after 128 days. Now this left barely 3 months for Sam Mendes and his editor on the picture, Lee Smith, to get a final cut of the movie together, which they had to deliver. And I've told this story before, but one of the things I find fascinating about the brilliant Mad Max Fury Road is they gave themselves, in the edit of that film, 3 months just to watch all of the footage that they'd been shooting. In the case of Spectre, they had 3 months not just to watch it, but also to fashion the final cut of the movie. Now, of course, editing had been going on while Spectre was shooting, that a large editing team was based at Pinewood in the UK. Even while the units around the world were shooting footage, it was all going back to London, and that meant they were working on the footage, and as the production continued its globe-trotting ways, they were uploading the footage to a system that's very commonly used now called Pix, and that allowed the creators, Mendes and the producers, to keep track of the film from wherever they are or wherever they were in the world. And then they also needed 6 visual effects companies to come in to work on Spectre. The editing, the hours were inevitably very long, Smith leading the team. And it got to the point where it was just the weekend before the first press screening of the movie, and this is just days before, that Mendes locked down the final cut of the movie. That it was on a Sunday that he finished it all off, and by Wednesday, Thursday, he was having to promote and shoot the movie. He did a press junket that was pretty much on the exhausted side. Now, September 2015 had come the confirmation that Sam Smith was writing the title song. I should acknowledge that as well. And also, there was some concern from Sony that Spectre it was on the edgy side and was going to get a 15 certificate. And so this was something Sony couldn't risk. It needed a 12A. That would work perfectly for Skyfall. And so an early version of Spectre was shown to the BBFC, and the BBFC in turn advised that in the UK, Spectre was going to get a 15 certificate. And Sony didn't want that and took advice from the BBFC, and 2 scenes were cut back slightly ahead of the final formal submission of Spectre to get the necessary 12A. Now, the notable thing about doing it that way round is it meant that they could honestly say the film wasn't cut. Only one version was officially submitted to get the final classification for the movie, but the BBFC had been involved in advising them on what was required to get it in under the line. Now, there was huge anticipation for this James Bond film. And I've covered it before on this podcast a long time ago, but so much more has come out in that time already to this point. The world premiere was the 26th of October 2015, and one of the byproducts of the truncated editing time was the running time of the movie was 148 minutes, the longest James Bond film at that point. Now, trailers had come out and anticipation was still absolutely sky high, so there was no question that they weren't looking at something big, but it was carrying the weight of its forerunner, grossing $1 billion. And this, in the end, one report suggested that it cost $300 million to make the movie. So certainly the final budget was between 250 and 300. The first press screening took place on October the 21st. I remember the queues going around Leicester Square in London. And the response to the movie was, it was good. Spectre is seen a lot of the time now as one of the weaker James Bond movies, but the early response to it, I remember this at the time as well, was really quite positive. That the critical response noted that it was below Skyfall, but on the whole, it was regarded as good. In fact, it got 5-star reviews from a couple of outlets as well. Daniel Craig, in particular, was earning a huge amount of respect and acclaim for his portrayal of James Bond. There were slight pushbacks. How much did we get of Monica Bellucci in the movie? Really, she's great, but we don't get an awful lot of time with her. And over time, I think it was the pushback really came against Spectre to the point where I think history hasn't been as kind to it as it has been to other James Bond movies, not helped by the fact that there was some involved have been adding to the criticism of it. But let's deal with the release first. I mean, in the UK, it went absolutely nuts, as you'd expect. The US release of the movie came the weekend of November the 6th to the 8th, a week after the UK release, opened with $70 million. A really good, smart opening. Perfectly happy with that, Sony was. The number 2 that week was also a new opener as well. The Peanuts movie opened with 44 million. The Martian had topped the chart the week before, but I mean, lots of big releases had just given James Bond a very, very wide berth. A significant release the same week in the US was Spotlight, opened on 5 screens. It would go on to win the Best Picture Oscar the following year, but it was just it was a platform release at that point that was going to take its time. Spectre also held good business for its second weekend. It dropped 52%, which is not particularly shabby. New openers that weekend were Love the Coopers, The 33, and nothing really that was going to particularly test it, but it was the final Hunger Games film that eventually dethroned it. That opened on Spectre's third week of release with $102 million, so far more than James Bond had managed. But by that point, Spectre had $150 million in the bank. Even as films such as The Good Dinosaur and Creed followed the week after, Spectre was still doing okay, still hanging in there. But the difference was it wasn't doing Skyfall numbers, and that was the disappointment really for Sony. It wasn't getting the repeat business of Skyfall, which didn't help, and the enthusiasm for Spectre was just not really as great. So by way of comparison, Spectre's box office gross in the US was 200 million, Skyfall's was 304 million. Spectre's international gross, not including American money, was 680 million. Skyfall's was 800 million. Skyfall grossed $1.1 billion. Spectre, 880 million. And it had cost an awful lot more to make and to market, to the point where it was felt that Sony barely scraped any profit off it at all, because Sony didn't even have the home entertainment release rights, which at that point were with 20th Century Fox. Now, Spectre has been analysed a lot since, and it's worth quoting some of the people vaguely involved in it as well. I mean, Pierce Brosnan, for one, to say vaguely involved, a former James Bond, he was fairly critical fairly quickly. He said, I thought it was too long. The story was kind of weak, he said to Hitfix. It could have been condensed. It kind of went on too long. It really did. And it's quite hard to disagree with that, really. But on the Team Deakins podcast, both editor Lee Smith and director Sam Mendes have separately spoken about the film. And Mendes is quite interesting on it because he talks about they never really had the control over the film that they had over Skyfall, that the script was never locked, that they never really had the ending that they had with Skyfall for Spectre, and that they were still generating story or still shaping where it was going to go, even as filming was underway. And once the train had left the metaphorical station, there was no stopping it. In fact, he would chat to the AV Club just a few years ago, and he just said the 10 months of downtime on Skyfall while they were waiting for the financing to come together, that's when the script really turned round, because we had the time to go down blind alleys and try things. And he said with Spectre, that time was not afforded to me, and you can see the difference in the script. Dave Bautista also, while promoting Glass Onion, the second Knives Out film, just a year or so from when this podcast has been recorded, he would talk about the contrast of working with Daniel Craig on a James Bond film and working with him on Knives Out. And he just said he was really put through pressure on Bond. He said you could feel that he was under a lot of pressure. He didn't seem like the happiest person on Spectre, but on Glass Onion, it was the complete opposite. He was just so much fun, and he was always smiling and happy and interacting a lot more. On Spectre, of course, he was nursing a broken leg and was very much going through the pain barrier to keep going. And by the time it got to the end of Spectre, I mean, he gave an interview which, let's just charitably say, suggested his time with James Bond was done. Certainly Sam Mendes' was. He's talked about there's no upside really to going back and trying again. You can't really win. And after Spectre, he just said he wouldn't do another James Bond adventure. For Daniel Craig, he was, the inclination, certainly the hints was, he wasn't going to return either. But of course, he did, and I've covered No Time to Die, his 007 swan song, on a previous episode of the podcast. But I'm overrunning already, and I've just got to the halfway point of this episode, so I'm just going to quickly do my parish notices before moving on with the rest. If you like this podcast, first of all, thank you so much for listening to it. I do appreciate it. I mean, we've been going for 5 years now, and it's only thanks to people like yourself supporting and lending me your ears that it keeps it going, and it's got as far as it's got. There are 3 further ways you can support it if you're inclined to do so. I'm appreciative of all, any, none of these. If you want to financially support the podcast, then go to patreon.com/Simon Brew. You get the podcast ad-free in return. You get it most weeks early as well. You also find out the gossip of what we're up to behind the scenes. If you could just subscribe at your podcast home of choice, that doesn't cost anything, and that helps with algorithms and things I don't understand. And then the third way is leave a review, ideally a hugely positive one. That with small podcasts, well, small independent podcasts like this, really helps enormously and is much appreciated. The other plug I'm going to do is for Film Stories magazine. We've just published issue 44. We're nearly through on issue 45 as well. This is a print film magazine full of film mayhem where we shine light on all sorts of films that don't necessarily always get the light shone on them. You can find all of our magazines at store.filmstories.co.uk. Our Sneakers Blu-ray is there as well. 2 more Blu-rays I'm just working on at the same time as well. More on those shortly. But given that I'm overrunning, I've barreled through those parish notices. I'm going to get straight on with the second of the 2 films I'm talking about in this episode. Let's have a bit of football. How about that? Let's go back to the 1990s. I'm going to play you a clip from the trailer. Come to the story, the other side of this.
Another brilliant performance there tonight, laddie. You were there tonight, huh? Tony Curry wants to give you a trial.
Jimmy, it's your trial tomorrow. You want to make it a quiet night?
Good fighting. Keep fighting.
Have 7 large whiskies, please.
Where the bloody hell have you been?
You smell like a brewery. You're out, Sam.
You couldn't have cocked it up better if you'd have tried.
Is this what you want? Strippers and boozers, huh?
Excuse me. You're sorry? You're selfish. But potential's no bloody good if you haven't got the courage to do something with it.
It's a bad kid.
I know you do that.
You better not blow it.
He won't let it.
Is it game tomorrow?
Just need to let you play.
Come on, lads, I'm breaking it, come on!
So we're going from a film that grossed, inverted commas, disappointing 880 million or so, to one that didn't even get a US release in the end. This is When Saturday Comes from 1996, directed by Maria Geiss, who wrote the screenplay based on a story by James Daly, and starring Sean Bean, Emily Lloyd, Pete Postlethwaite in the cast as well as some former footballers too. And so director Maria Geiss isn't perhaps the most immediate person you think of when it comes to making a football movie, and this is association football, not American football, in the northeast of England. Geiss was born in Puerto Rico. She was 9 years old when her family moved to America and hadn't really grown up in and around the sport. But she was married to a producer at the time by the name of James Daly when the idea for the movie first arose, and it was Daly who was the catalyst for it as well. That the pair were living in Los Angeles and he'd had a taste of a football career and he just thought there might be a story in there. Now, at this point, Geiss was building up her directorial experience, and in 1994 she was shadowing directors on primetime television shows. Meanwhile, Daly was working and landed work with a production company called Davis Panzer Productions, which was making motion pictures. And one of those motion pictures was Highlander 3. Now, Highlander 3 isn't a hugely regarded film in the Highlander saga. There aren't that many hugely regarded films in the Highlander saga, in fairness, but it was a crucial project for When Saturday Comes, because Highlanders, the first 3 Highlanders, of course, starred Christopher Lambert, and he would prove an unlikely turning point in the story. So, just going back to that story, Daly had, in his younger years, had a trial at Huddersfield Town Football Club. He'd grown up in the northeast of England, and he wrote a story called A Pint of Bitter that was about someone trying to break into playing football. Now, Geiss took this and turned it into a script that she thought might work and that Daly was happy with as well. And Daly, in turn, passed this on to Christopher Lambert. And Lambert, wouldn't you know, absolutely loved it and wanted to produce the film. He wanted to help produce it. And he wanted to do so with Geiss directing it as well. So of all the people to turn this particular project, going into the research of it, I wouldn't have thought it was him, but there he is as a producer on the movie. And so the plan was a football sporting story with a little bit of a Rocky tinge to it, set around football and set in a working class environment. Now, Lambert at this point in his career as well was a point where his work was attracting investors because his name carried some box office weight to it. Films such as Fortress, for instance, which I covered before. I love Fortress. And as Geiss told me in an interview, she said he was like a rock star back then and could get almost anything financed. And she also made the point when we chatted that at the stage these conversations were taking place, independent cinema was bubbling a little bit, that the golden age of television was just a few years away, that people weren't yet shooting on digital, and there were independent filmmakers shooting on 16mm and 35mm who were able to get movies out there and people were picking it up, and it was still a period where you could get that you had a decent shot at getting them exhibited. In the case of A Pint of Bitter, the script wasn't quite there at the point they were doing some early financing conversations, and so Lambert hired Geiss for another project, a film that he was involved with called North Star that would ultimately be made with James Caan and Catherine McCormack in the ensemble. But Lambert was happy with Geiss's work, and he then introduced her to a producer called Mia Taper, and also the chief executive of a company called New Regency, a man called David Matalon. The dominoes here were falling in the right direction because you meet one person, they introduce you to another, and they might be the person who introduces you to the person who unlocks the entire project. And that's pretty much what happened here, that an introduction was made to Geiss, to producers Dame Sharon Harrell and Jane Barclay, who were working they had a company called Capital Films. Now, Capital Films was looking for projects and also looking for female directors at a point where that really was not commonplace at all. And so there was interest there. Now, the script was still being pitched to other companies as well, but a lot of the pushback they were getting was the idea that Geiss was going to be attached to direct the film. You can't have a woman directing a film about men and football and working class stuff. That was the kind of pushback they were getting. And so when they stood their ground and said, no, Geiss is going to be directing this, the investors were running away and the rejections were building up. I think they took it to around 40 different companies in the end who were just saying no, and the gender of the director was a real point of contention. Well, not for Capital Films. In fact, Capital Films, this was just what it was looking for. And it had confidence in Maria Geiss as well. I mean, by this stage, she directed a few short movies as well, and she knew her way around a set. They were clear and confident about that. And also the feeling was the film wasn't going to be particularly expensive to make. And so $2 million was allocated to the production with the idea that you've got to get it moving quickly. Let's just take advantage of the moment that we've got and see if we can get this made. So of those 40 or so companies that Daly and Geiss had taken the project to, and Lambert as well, finally they had one that said yes. Now, separately, Sean Bean was at the infancy of a film career where he died in lots of films. By 1995, he'd been cast as the villain in a 007 movie, GoldenEye, wouldn't you know? Second mention on the podcast for GoldenEye. But GoldenEye wasn't out at this point, but he was earning a lot of praise on television for taking the lead role in the series drama Sharp. And Bean was also a huge football fan, supporting Sheffield United Football Club. And so the script it seemed to make sense to get the script to him. He was the right age for the lead character of Jimmy Muir. But the problem was the screenplay that had been put together had the main character dreaming of playing for Sheffield Wednesday. Now, I don't know how football you are, but let's just say Sheffield United and Sheffield Wednesday aren't necessarily two of the friendliest teams to put side by side against each other. There's a lot of local rivalry there. And so once Geiss learned that Sean Bean was actually a United fan, she went through the script and changed all the references from Sheffield Wednesday to Sheffield United instead. Now, here's where a further bit of fortune favoured them, because Daly's family lived a few streets away from Sean Bean's mum in the northeast of England, and so they arranged to get the script to him that way, that a family member popped it through the door of Sean Bean's mother, and she got the script to her son, and he rang James Daly in Los Angeles, hugely keen to do it. He'd read about, as soon as he was reading about Sheffield United, I mean, that certainly helped enormously, but also he really wanted to do the film, and he was on board very, very, very quickly, and he was a further catalyst to getting the rest of the cast in place as well. So key signings, if you like, for the ensemble were Emily Lloyd in the role of Annie Doherty, and she was suggested by Christopher Lambert. And Pete Postlethwaite, meanwhile, took on the key role. I love the work of Pete Postlethwaite. He took on the key role here of Ken Jackson. And Postlethwaite had been suggested by Sean Bean. The pair had worked together on the Sharp TV series. The film was very much going ahead. They got the cast in place. The crew was coming together. And now they had the challenge of how do you make a sporting movie in and around Sheffield? Because it was important that they were going to go on location. They were going to go to South Yorkshire to shoot When Saturday Comes, as the film was now known, and filming began in January of 1995. Now, Geiss knew that capturing the football action was going to be really important for the movie, and she figured at heart that her cameras would need to follow the ball to be able to follow the action. But also she knew that she didn't have the luxury of presenting a football match in the same way that a television company would be able to. That a television company would be able to just load up 6, 7, 8 cameras pointing at the pitch. She was an independent movie on a very tight budget with film cameras that would capture, 11 minutes of footage in one magazine. And a magazine of film was costing money. And so every time they set the camera rolling, the budget, the amount of money they had in the bank was starting to tick down. And so she knew for the most part she would have one camera pointing at the pitch. On a couple of days she might have a B camera as well. And she was really conscious that they needed to pre-plan this, that they couldn't rock up and just try and capture what they could. They needed to know exactly what kind of shots they were looking for. And so she made a key hire. Now, there are 2 cinematographers credited on When Saturday Comes. One is Grant Cameron. The person I'm talking about here is a man called Jerry Fisher, because Fisher had filmed John Huston's legendary football movie Escape to Victory, known as Victory in the US. Covered it before extensively on this podcast, and with Fisher on board, they mapped out what they needed from the sporting matches themselves. And it was Fisher who pointed out that they didn't need the ball so much as they had to capture the drama and the emotion. And they were looking at touch points such as films like Saturday Night, Sunday Morning, and particularly Ken Loach's Cares. That came up as well. Who can forget Brian Glover's demon PE teacher in Cares? Oh, it still makes me shudder. And so they had a way that they could do that, and they were going to be able to do some location work there, which I'll talk to at an actual football match, which I'll come to in a second. Now, for Pete Postlethwaite, he doesn't talk about this a lot in his memoir, actually. His memoir, which was written as he knew his life was coming to an end, is a bit of a whistle-stop tour of his extensive 1990s work. And the year that When Saturday Comes was shot, he described in his book as the busiest of his life. This was 1995. So he went from narrating Henry Selick's film with James the Giant's Peach to filming Dragonheart, and also taking on this role in When Saturday Comes, an extensive and crucial role in the film. Now, Postlethwaite wrote in his book about the joy of working with Sean Bean again, and how and Geiss would just say that Postlethwaite was a delight on this, that he walked into the production hotel in Sheffield and gave me a huge hug without ever having met me, and that basically just said we became friends instantly. Now, as anyone who's read Postlethwaite's memoir would know, he was very serious about his acting, but also he was he was incredibly supportive of Geiss, appreciating, she believes, that he knew what she was up against, or at least he recognised what she was up against. A first-time director on a very male film, and she wasn't shooting it in her home country either. Not that Postlethwaite wasn't pushing back against his director, as Geiss would tell me. He picked up on any inauthenticity. And she also said he was a master of restraint. His idea was do the opposite of what's expected, hold it in. And she spoke incredibly fondly of her time working with him. Those crucial football matches were shot at Bramall Lane, the home of Sheffield United Football Club, and they were shot during a game against Manchester United, a very windy day as well. And so the crowd turned up expecting to watch Sheffield United playing Manchester United, but at half-time, they were allowed to capture the material that they needed for the movie. Now, Guy said she didn't get the most warm welcome of some of the Sheffield United fans. She said, let me quote this, "A few fans didn't like me being there. A woman," she said. "One told her to get the cluck off the pitch, you silly clucking..." What does that say? Bunt? Can't read that properly. But she also said she didn't care because she just said it was one of the greatest days of her life, filming in front of this massive crowd that they could. And also, it relied a little bit on the crowd hanging around to see Sean Bean taking penalties at half time during their match. And to her delight, and a little bit to her surprise, I think, they didn't go off and get their refreshments or anything. There were sufficient people who stayed behind to watch this movie being shot on the pitch in front of them. Now, not unlike Spectre, this was a film, although the scale of it slightly differently, this was a film that was being edited as they went along in certain points as well. George Akers was editing the movie, and he was cutting together the football sequences as they went because he knew they didn't have an awful lot of time, but also he knew that the games themselves needed to be able to flow. And so by cutting those sequences together as they went, he was able to isolate the bits that weren't quite working so guys could go back and get the extra footage she needed to get the movie right. And so by early 1995, the film had wrapped up. It wasn't a particularly long shoot, but there was a decent amount of post-production time. The plan was to release it in the spring of 1996, and the idea was that would give them a period of time to sell overseas rights, to possibly even do some festival work with the movie. George Akers would undertake the main edit in London, and Capitol was really keen to get the film into the Cannes Film Festival. And what they wanted to do was put it in for the Directors' Fortnight, which is a prize that Cannes awards for first-time directors. But also, guys would just say that they wanted to get it into the marketplace in order to sell all the distribution territories they possibly could. And that worked for Capitol Film, that they did get an edit together in time to take it to Cannes. And what that meant was they sold the vast majority of foreign locations, as in non-UK locations around the world. But the one they didn't manage to sell was America, much to Maria Geiss's disappointment. And she explained the reason was that they overpriced it, that they got someone who was basically looking to overpay or suggesting that the price was way too high for the majority of American distributors. And so, I mean, Geiss reflected on that with some sadness when I talked to her about it, but it was still gunning for a fairly sizable UK release. I remember this, that it came out on the 1st of March 1996 in the UK, and it was relatively well publicised as well. And the response to it was, well, it was okay. I mean, there aren't too many reviews from it out there that you'll find online, but I remember kind of 3 stars, a degree of warmth to it, and the feeling that the football worked and that there was underlying drama in it that worked as well. And so there wasn't really anything that would dissuade it from doing well at the box office, but still, it didn't do wonderfully well at the box office, and Geiss would describe that as quite a staggering blow, and it wasn't helped by the way the film was put across to the press as well. And the press notes were apparently noting that it was directed by the wife of the producer and not really giving her perhaps the credit she deserved there for writing the screenplay and directing the film. And of course, James Daly produced the film as well and came up with the story for it. He deserves his due credit, but Geiss just felt she was a little bit shortchanged by the way the film was ultimately put out. She would also tell me in the end, actually, she never saw a penny for her work directing it either. And then there was that hammer blow too of it not getting a US release. And then in the midst of it all, Geiss and Daly were separating as well. I don't go into personal stories, but it was just a note of what she was going through and what they were going through at this period in time. But against that, it still opened at number 6 at the UK box office. The film would gross just over £700,000 in the UK. And when you factor in that Capital had sold overseas rights as well, I mean, a tidy profit, even if that didn't go back necessarily to the people you think it might have gone back to. It did its best business away from London. Certainly the further north up England you went, the better the returns for When Saturday Comes were, and the box office breakdown reflected that. It would get a video and DVD release, which it was a decent video rental as well. That was put out by Guild. I should note that Anne Dudley did the score for it as well, and just a couple of years later she was doing the score for The Full Monty and getting Oscar nominated for her work as well. But the aftermath of it for Maria Geiss wasn't particularly upbeat, really, that she would struggle off the back of this to get another film made. The fact that it hadn't got a US release had hurt her there. And so it got to the point where in 2015, she took something of a handbrake turn. And as she described to me, she became the instigator of the biggest industry-wide federal investigation into the opportunities for female directors in Hollywood. And she's channeled that into a whole load of... it really is worth looking her up and seeing the work that she's done on representation for female directors and paving opportunities. And so that, as a takeaway, that's something. And When Saturday Comes was an unlikely catalyst for that. I should note, just to round the story off as well, there was talk of a When Saturday Comes 2 at one point as well. That bubbled up in 2017. And whilst Maria Geiss wasn't involved with that, the people behind the project did get in touch with her and she gave it a blessing. That James Daly was involved with it. Dino Jones had penned the script, and the idea was that it would bring back Sean Bean's character and see where he was all these years later. But this has been recorded in 2023, 6 years on, and it just looks like the project has fizzled a little bit in development hell. Ordinarily, I'd be able to give you far more detailed box office numbers and such like of a film, but the release of it was just so limited, certainly outside of the UK. The fact that they managed to get it made so quickly and so effectively, really, and I do think When Saturday Comes is a good film. I do think it's worth seeking out. Well, it's a small, independent British hit, minor success story of the 1990s, and a film that doesn't deserve, I would suggest, to be forgotten. And do look Maria Geiss up. Some incredible work. And that brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you for listening and thank you for your time. This is the episode that just comes before a short summer break for the podcast. I'm just going to be downing tools for a few weeks while we're working on some other stuff. And also, to be honest, I just need a rest. You can probably hear my voice isn't in the best of shape. I've been determined to get through this one. If I haven't bored you completely, you can still catch up with what I'm up to on Twitter at Simon Brew. I'm on Threads at Simon.brew. I'm just trying to work out how that works though. Film Stories is on Facebook at facebook.com/filmstoriesonline. It's on Twitter at Film Stories. It's got a website. Film Stories does have a website, filmstories.co.uk. That's updated every weekday with movie news, reviews, features and such like. Store.filmstories.co.uk is where you'll find all of our stuff for sale. youtube.com/filmstories. We've got bits and bobs there, looking to do a bit more with that shortly. And the Patreon again is patreon.com/Simon Brew. But I just want to say, just as I draw this to an end for a summer break, and I do take a little bit of downtime at this point every year, it is a point where I kind of reflect on the end of another year of the podcast. I just want to say thank you again for all the support people have given Film Stories, for the number of people who listen to it, the number of people who recommend it, the number of people who've left reviews and just kind of encouraged me. It is massively, massively appreciated. I love movies. I'm going to spend the next few weeks watching an awful lot more of them. I've got so many more episodes of this podcast I want to do. For now, though, I'm just going to leave you in peace. I'm going to wish you the very best. I'm going to thank you for your support. Thank you for listening. The main thing, as always, is you all stay safe and well. And I will be back soon with another bunch of Film Stories. Take care all. Bye-bye.